Thank you for that question. Um, for me, thinking about radical literary forms and thinking about literary radicalism as a practice, right, as a political practice and also as an aesthetic practice, is rooted in specific historical contexts, and it's rooted in the context of movements and struggles. And to me, progressive is also, for example, a very important um, concept and also a specific historical moment and also a tradition of writing, right? But I think why I sometimes use and why I've used radical and referred to that is because it encompasses worlds outside of progressive writing that don't necessarily draw from that specific lineage of anti-colonial Urdu North Indian writing, which are maybe drawing on um, other genealogies of feminist thought and feminist literary practice, or other forms of anti-caste writing, for example, would also not necessarily fit into that. So for me, radical is sort of broader in its emphasis, in its scope of capturing the multiple sites of literary resistance in South Asia. And then when I do talk about it in specific contexts, I always try to ground it in the movement. So for me, thinking about literary radicalism and thinking about radical is also, it's always embedded in movements and in social context. So I have a very historicist approach to that rather than simply a formal or an aesthetic consideration. So that's how I approach the term radical in literary studies. Thank you for that. Those two questions. I think I see part of the work that you've cited in this paper is coming, out of a kind of response, and it's coming out of a collective conversation. This is a paper that is part of my work with a collective called Revolutionary Papers, which is a project which is dedicated to looking at um, anti-colonial and left archives from the global south. So it's also a comparativist project. It's not just a South Asia project. And part of the kind of critical impetus for this project came from conversations in all of our disciplines. So we're not all comparative literature people in our collective, but the conversation in the academy in general around decolonization and decolonizing the curriculum and decolonizing the university. And increasingly, the sense was, that a lot of the conversation around decolonization is being co-opted and becoming increasingly a buzzword, or as Tuck and Yang have referred to it famously as a metaphorization of what decolonization actually entails, which is actual material struggles for sovereignty, for freedom, for liberation, embedded in particular contexts. So the kind of turn to these periodicals, these regional vernacular forms, and these localized vocabularies of anti-colonial resistance, or of Marxism, of revolutionary internationalism, was to think about decolonization not as the kind of changing of curricula in global north universities, but as movements emanating from contexts that are marginalized and that are understudied, right? So how do we think about decolonization not through the kind of dominant historiography that surrounds canonical figures like Nehru or Nkrumah, right? Or even Fanon, who is consecrated as a kind of theoretician of decolonization. But rather, how do we begin to think about decolonization through the grassroots processes of led by movements, led by collectives, and taking place in particular local contexts. So the kind of um, focus on these magazines and political pamphlets, which are understudied and marginal forms of our discipline, right? So, if you speak about English or even comparative literature, the novel enjoys a privileged position as a genre that is analyzed. But there are all these other non-fiction forms that require that same amount of rigor, right, of analysis and historicization. So I think the project is kind of focused on looking at decolonization as in its grassroots and ground up manifestations and interpretations, and also seeing the local and the vernacular as not a provincialized circumscribed sort of site, but rather as a space for worldly theorizing, right, and for global thought. So there is no reason why, for example, I work on um, thinkers and theater practitioners and writers associated with the Mazdoor Kisan Party who are writing primarily in Punjabi or in Urdu. And there's no reason why their texts are not theoretical texts that are interpreting and transforming Marxism, but rather, we don't need to treat them as texts that we apply Marxist theory to, if you see what I mean. So the kind of my drive to kind of think with the periodical and think with forms that are marginalized is to consider them not just as aesthetic objects, but as sites of thinking and sites of the coining of theory and concepts. So how do we begin to decolonize our theorization of decolonization, right? The question really is that. In terms of thinking about a practice of alternative archiving, I think that's more, it's something I don't have an answer to, and it's something that I believe is a process. And I can list, just a few ideas. For example, I think we have to, number one, think more expansively about forms. An archive is not necessarily a physical space with reams of text, and a librarian who kind of manages them or catalogs them. An archives need to be oral, archives need to be performative in form, especially in parts of the world that we work on where large sections of the population and mass movements and participants of mass movements are functionally illiterate, right? Maybe they don't read. And that does not mean that they did not have a relationship with literature or with poetry, but oral infrastructures and cultural practices and social relations were the mode through which often poetry and literature and print was circulating, right? So, first, decenter the physical textual archive to think about alternative forms of archiving. Second, um, I think asking the important question of why are we archiving? Why do we need an archive of XYZ? Um, is it to is it a fetish and an object, or how can that archive be placed into a productive relationship with the collective memory of a movement or ongoing community infrastructure? So archiving, radical archiving, alternative archiving has to serve as an institution that can reproduce and and help, aid the survival of marginalized histories of um, politics and communities that are facing erasure, whether it's under the state, and whether it's because of censorship, or whether it's because of the kind of imperative of the market and of commodification. So, those are two things, and I could go on, but I won't. But I think those are two kind of important lines that I do think along. And just the one last thing I would say is it has to be collectivist and collaborative, and I think a lot of times our work as academics can be very lonely because we write books and papers by ourselves at our desks, and this is one of those parts of our job which for which we should collaborate, we should put our heads together. So I think, yes, radical alternative archiving practices have to start from a point of collectivity. Yeah, I'm very grateful for that question because the monograph I'm working on right now is really quite centrally concerned with form. So one of the articles I've written, which is based on a chapter that's going to go in the book, is about Heer and the story of Heer and the narrative of Heer as a kind of genre, the way that that genre moves across oral forms and textual forms and as a devotional practice as well. I see these all as generic concerns, right, of Heer Ranja as narrative. And when Amrita Preetham and Nasreen Anjum Bhatti are taking up the story of Heer, the voice of Heer, they are also intervening in and from a position of having a deep sort of social and cultural immersion in how the story is narrativized in Punjab and in North India more broadly. And they're also making very specific points of intervention, right? So when for example, when Amrita Preetham, says in her iconic poem that today I call on Varis Shah, there is, it invokes the kind of insertion of the author, and there she's reclaiming that kind of authority, right, that the male author has. So I do think that yes, genre and convention is a very important part of it, and I think it's also important to highlight that because a lot of times when we look at what we see as political poetry, we consider it to be propagandist, we consider it to have at most a crude relationship with form and literary convention. So I'm very invested in demonstrating that that is exactly what is not the case, that there is a very, form is part and parcel of the politics of the content that these feminist poets are working with. So I think yes, reclaiming form, reinterpreting form, sometimes subverting genre. These are all strategies through which the particular feminist interventions are being enacted. And there's a politics in which of responding to the state and the military establishment, but there's also a politics of responding to the literary establishment, right, as women authors. So yeah, 100%. I think that the question of form is very central to the feminist politics and the feminist poetics of this work. Thank you for that question. And I think what it gets at is some of the debates that are really at the heart of Punjab studies and Punjabi literary studies. One of those is the issue of Punjabiyat and how we use that as a conceptual categorization to look at literary formations, to use Farina Meer's term, in Punjab. Um, so I think it's very important to remember that in the context of South Asia, really any linguistic and literary formation is cross communal, is cross cultural, is because that is the lay of the land, that there have been overlaps and the coexistence of different religious communities. So in that sense, I think it's not necessarily something that's unique to Punjabi and to Punjab. And the other, I think, important thing is to also remember that North India, which is the region I can speak about more, so that's what I focus on more specifically, is a multilingual, historically a multilingual literary and linguistic formation. So even the poets we're talking about, Nasreen Anjum Bhatti is a multilingual poet. Amrita Pritam, multilingual, right? Would also get write in Hindi or get her works translated in Hindi. So it's important to remember that um, language politics and nationalist politics as tied to ethnic identity is a much later construct, and is also sometimes driven by a certain kind of politics that does not necessarily hold for all, for capturing the kind of expanse of literary production in the region. That being said, while it is a multilingual formation, and of course Francesca Orsini has written extensively about this, I do think that the fact that it is multilingual does not mean that hierarchies are not present in that multilingual landscape, right? So yes, Urdu and English and Hindi and Braj and Punjabi are mixing and coexisting in the literary culture of this region, but given the kind of logics of hierarchization that the colonial state introduces and then the post-colonial state kind of deepens and extends, of course there is a hegemonic relationship that Urdu develops with Punjabi and that English develops with Urdu and with Punjabi in that sense, right? So to me, I think it's important to to bear in mind that there isn't to not to exceptionalize the case of Punjab, because we are in South Asia dealing with always the multiplicity of religious community and linguistic plurality. So I don't want to exceptionalize Punjab, but I think it's important to remember the hierarchization. So I also don't want to romanticize Punjabi literature necessarily as a space where Sikh theology can mix with Sufi thought, and that's sort of this harmonious pre-partition nostalgia. Whereas, of course, the kind of inequalities and distinctions and exclusions of caste, of patriarchy, of class also undercut and shape that very landscape. So I'm interested in looking at the relationship between different language and literary formations through the prism of these other inequalities, or particularly those of caste and of class and of gender. Yeah. I think it's important to remember that in terms of thinking about the state of Punjabi literature, um, is that it is a bordered literature. So I work on both in Indian Punjab and Pakistani Punjab. So whenever we have to try to make sense of the literary formation, you always have to kind of operate in this cross-border context, and the framework of the nation is has to be stretched, right, to make sense of Punjabi writing in India and Punjabi writing in Pakistan. And I think that in some ways, the two kind of phases that you mention are each have spawned their own legacies in post-colonial Punjab. So um, the 1960s movement and moment that I've written about with respect to Punjab, which has its sort of corresponding tendencies in India as well, because in India in the 19 Indian Punjab 1960s you have a Maoist peasant insurgency in Punjab, and it produces some of the greatest sort of poetry of protest, which you have Sant Ramadasi, you have Avtar Singh Pash, names Amarjit Chandan that come out of that. And I feel like that trajectory has its own legacy, and its own practitioners and sort of flag bearers. So it's very much alive in Punjabi literary culture, which is a kind of left progressive sensibility that you do encounter. On the other hand, there are also ways in which the emergence of literary festivals, and which is just one institution that I'm giving an example of, but there is also more and more this kind of commodification of the question of Punjabi, the question of Punjabi literature, and an attempt to globalize it, which is very justified also because there's a large diaspora. But in terms of the politics around it, there's much more multiplicity. So there is also sort of what I would describe as a Punjabi nationalism, which is emerging on and has been emergent on both sides. But the kind of left trajectory also lives on in its ways. So it's hard to say that there is one um, kind of overarching consensus. Rather, I think one would look in those places, as who's on the margins of Punjabi writing, and who's kind of in enjoys a certain kind of state patronage or state approval. And of course, in sort of East Punjab in India, there has been, it is the language of the state. It is also a language of a kind of minority Sikh identity in what is increasingly becoming a Hindu majority and Hindu majoritarian state under the BJP. So it's a very different trajectory. And largely, the other, I think, important thing I would say about this, the kind of situation for both Punjabs is the Persianization of Punjabi and Punjabi associated sort of literary cultures in Pakistan, and a Sanskritization on the other hand on the other side. So the kind of tragic consequence of this is that while in the 1950s and 1960s there was a lot more cross border collaboration and publishing, and East Punjabi literary magazines and publishers would print a lot of West Punjabi books. And in West Punjab, people were reading East Punjabi books because by that point the vocabulary was still largely shared. It was from the pre 1947 sort of shared context. So that has really kind of created that divergence, and that's the effect of post-colonial borders and post-colonial statehood. That there's this kind of distinct sense in which West Punjabi literary culture and East Punjabi literary culture has developed. So I think the question of uh, you know regional versus national, I think the problem for me is in that particular articulation of the question of scale, which is that which is regional cannot be national or cannot be global in its scope. And I think the way I kind of respond to it is, you know for me, for example, thinking back to what a lot of Punjabi intellectuals in the 60s are theorizing as their language politics, and they're drawing a lot on, and they're quite inspired by um, the particular polemics that are taking place in Africa at this point between Ngugi wa Thiong'o, who is talking about decolonizing the language of African literature and is talking about a return to writing in African languages. And I'm sure you are aware of this, but Ngugi starts off with a career in writing in English, but eventually forswears writing in any other language except his native Kikuyu, right? Which is not a Pan African language. It is not even a Pan Kenyan language. It's not the first language for all Kenyans. But there is a sense in which embedding oneself in the region and speaking to the region is a priority for these writers. Now, if there are people who would dismiss that prerogative, then that's a political disagreement, right? Between those for whom, how do you how do you become a global subject? How do you become a national subject? You start from a point of embedding yourself in the local, right? There is no global without a local, and therefore that situatedness is kind of essential, from which you begin to view the world, from which you begin to analyze um, transformations that are planetary in scope. So I don't see the regional and the national as being in tension, and I think it is something we need to maybe fundamentally rethink in terms of how we view the role of language, and how we view the relationship of language and literature and audience, and what we see as globality, or what makes something a world literature. Isn't necessarily linguistic form, that could be one of the questions. So I read the Punjabi writers I work on as global intellectuals, and I do that not because they write in a global language, or I'm trying to argue that Punjabi is a globally legible, globally understood language in the way English is, or that it has the kind of legibility that Urdu would have, but because I'm trying to argue that the issues and concerns that they are tackling are national concerns, are global concerns. And related to that, I think I want to point towards the very long history of translation, and translation as a practice of connection across cultures and a connection across regions. So, for example, the Afro-Asian literary magazine Lotus, that was published out of Beirut, that was edited at one point by Faiz Ahmed Faiz when he was in exile in Beirut, fundamentally created those links, right? Which is, it was translating between these different languages and regional contexts. So I think writing in Punjabi doesn't have to mean that your work is not globally legible or cannot be nationally legible, because translation exists as that tool, and we should make good use of it. And revolutionary and progressive writers have made extensive use of translation in that regard. I think you're referring to, of course, Farida Mir's book on Heer texts in colonial Punjab, and their function in sort of what she describes as the Punjabi literary formation, as this cross caste, cross religious, socio-textual community, in which the Heer texts and Heer Ranja as a narrative becomes a kind of locus for articulating questions of transformation, social and political, that is underway in colonial Punjab. So in my work, I take that and I extend that in some senses. So one, I don't look only at print and only at textual forms. I think the way the Hiranja narrative is constructed and the way it circulates in the Punjabi literary formation, the sort of sites of devotion and orality, and also of popular performance. So, in the post colonial context, which is what I focus on, film, pop culture, it also becomes significant. And of course, Farina Mir has also talked about these non textual sites of circulation. I think those become very significant as well. Um, what is also significant about narratives like the Hi Ranja narrative is that they're telling and retelling, and that kind of repetition over the centuries also transforms them into these condensed metaphors, and these kind of condensed, what Gramsci describes as sedimentations within the common sense of Punjabi society, and as containing historical traces of memories of shared culture, but also of contestations, right? So when Udham Singh, who was an anti-colonial revolutionary, and he assassinated General O'Dwyer in London to avenge the massacre of Jallianwala Bagh, when he's tried in court and he's facing a sure certain sentence of death, right? He's asked, he's the Guru Granth Sahib, which is the Sikh holy scripture, is produced for him to take an oath of court on, and he says, no, I want a copy of Heer Ranjha instead. So this insertion of Heer Ranjha into this moment of political contestation also for me means that the Heer Ranjha narrative is also not just an indication of a shared culture, but it's also a language for resisting and for critique, right? Another example I have is a very different one, but I think relevant for answering your question. Is that in the 1980s, a kind of commemorative literary festival was organized to celebrate 200 years since the writing of Heer Waris Shah's Heer Waris Shah, right? Waris Shah's Heer, and a very prominent landed magnate and local politician, Abida Hussain, was invited to be the chief guest and the guest of honor at this event. And she eventually had to withdraw from the event because of protests by Seal community members saying, you cannot go and endorse this Heer Ranjha story because it makes a travesty of our values, and it um, it besmirches the honor of the Seal clan, because in the narrative he is a Seal, right? She's a Seal woman. And to me, both these instances also show how it's also a deeply, it also gets at these sides of contestations in Punjabi society, whether they are with respect to the state or with respect to patriarchal norms, right? In the case of the fact that even 200 years on, a fictional narrative about a woman, about Heer, still carries that resonance, that it unsettles Punjabi patriarchy essentially. So for me, the narrative is has this enduring and endearing quality as a much beloved story that Punjabis grow up with, but it's also a tool that can be marshaled for critique and contestation, which is the work that writers like Amrita Pritam and Nasreen Anjum Bhatti are doing. So my book, which is titled "Anti Border Literature and Resistance in India and Pakistan," it's tentatively titled, is concerned with looking at Indian and Pakistani Punjabi writing as a cross-border literary practice. So in the book, what I'm looking at is the ways in which post-partition Indian and Pakistani writers continue to inhabit and operate within the bounds of an imaginative geography of a shared pre-partition Punjab. And in doing so, they are unsettling and destabilizing both temporal boundaries between past and present. So, in the way that they will resurrect iconic historical and saintly figures like Bulle Shah or Heer or Dullah Bhatti, who was a 16th century social bandit. And they are also destabilizing and embodying this kind of cavalier rejection of the boundaries of the nation state, of the boundaries that separate India and Pakistan. So I'm interested in looking at cross-border Punjabi writing as a practice that both looks at borders and boundaries within. So the ways in which it interrogates caste, the ways in which it interrogates patriarchy, the ways in which it interrogates and challenges the authoritarianism of the post-colonial state, and at the same time how this is also a practice in which the border is kind of becoming a site for collaboration. And the way the methodology of the book is structured is that in each of the chapters, I examine a kind of particular genre or trope from the shared regional literary formation. So that could be the kafi, that could be the kissa, that could be sort of the Dullabhatti narrative, which is a var, which is a historical balladic form, and how those are being interpreted and reworked on both sides of the border. So some of the things I'm interested in is to revisit and reevaluate some of the paradigms of literary analysis in South Asia that have come out of partition studies, where partition has become a kind of almost limit case, right? And an end point after which we start to narrativize separate histories and separate literary trajectories for India and Pakistan. But rather, I'm interested in looking at the ways in which we can meaningfully think about India, Pakistan, and Punjab as a bordered space, even in the post-partition landscape. So it's a book which is about borders and boundaries in Punjab, and also against thinking with them as categories that often structure our imagination of literature.